Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by Internet Memes, the best way to make fun of your boss. Episode 202, React.js to React Native.
Hey, React Native Radio friends. Welcome back. This is the React Native Radio Podcast. I'm Jamon Holmgren, your host, and I'm joined today by two adventurous co-hosts. Robin is with me, and also today we're joined by a guest host, Jon Major Condon. I will intro Jon Major in a bit, but Robin, I just got a chance to listen to episode 198, where you were the primary host, and you interviewed Gant about machine learning. I kind of feel like you should be the one doing this intro right now.
I'm going to go ahead and say no thanks.
You did a great job though. Like I was like, I think I'm out of a job when I heard that one. That was really good. I was very impressed. So great job with that. And I'm sure it was all from like just right from the hip, right?
Totally live. Didn't have any notes or anything.
Yes, totally 100% extemporaneous. You never have to.
That totally matches my personality.
Robin, of course, is a senior software engineer located near Portland, Oregon at Infinite Red, specializes in React Native as well. And our guest host today is Jon Major Condon. Jon Major is a senior software engineer located in southern Wisconsin, and you'll be able to tell that by his thick Wisconsin accent, right, Jon Major?
Wisconsin.
I honestly I don't know if I've ever noticed anything, but you know what? I'm actually around a lot of people from the Midwest. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people in kind of the Pacific Northwest that came from the Midwest. So maybe it's just kind of steeped around me.
So, well, supposedly I had an accent back in the day because I was from Indiana, but I wasn't raised there. I was born there. My parents had the accent. So,
yeah. Oh, is that right? Okay. Yeah.
So you had an accent according to people from Wisconsin?
Yes. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Well, there's a little bit that happens kind of in my world because I'm Finnish American, and there's a lot of sort of Finnish Americanisms that slip into
interesting.
Now
I want to know what they are because you just sound like Jamon to me.
Well, I mean, like the most obvious one is everybody says sauna incorrectly. Everybody says sauna, and wait. It's not.
For real?
Yeah, well, yeah, for real. So, like, there's one Finnish word that everybody in the world knows, and they all pronounce it wrong. Like, if you go to Finland, they're going to say sauna. That's a like the Finnish way to say it. Sauna. There's actually kind of like a U in there.
All I can think about is the scene from Frozen where she comes up to the trading post. She's like, "Ooh, trading post and sauna."
Hey, you know what? Mm-hmm. I'm also half Norwegian, and the fact that they included lutefisk in Frozen
for good feelings
forgives anything that they anything else they do. I mean, I kid you not, we have lutefisk like almost every Christmas because my dad buys it and forces us to eat it.
Does it really give you good feelies?
Well, I mean, depends. Like if I don't have to be eating it, yes.
So it's not good.
You have to try it.
It's fermented. You have to try it someday. It's like fermented fish, right?
It's cod. It's not really. I don't know if it's fermented. It's cod, raw cod, soaked in lye.
Oh, it's soaked in lye. It doesn't sound very appetizing.
I mean, I don't know
it's
when you describe it that way. I guess. It was, I guess, a way that they preserved fish over the winter. And it's expensive, though. It's extremely expensive around here. So, Jon Major, you've never had lutefisk, even though you live in Wisconsin around a lot of Nordic people?
Not at all. I'm actually not a big fan of seafood. So I do have a lot of friends who do love seafood, and I try to steer them a different direction always. Give me a burger.
I think you'll be even less of a fan of seafood after you've had lutefisk, but we will move on. We will move on. Jon Major did just join Infinite Red this year. Welcome, by the way, Jon Major.
Thank you.
And he's also taken over the React Native newsletter as editor-in-chief, so that's pretty cool. We had a little bit of an opening happening there, and so you've stepped into those shoes, and you've done a great job so far, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Tell us a little bit about your coding background.
Sure. So 2013, actually before 2013, it was 2012. I was working at a factory and I decided that was not for me. And so I went to the library one day and I picked up a Java book thinking that I could learn it. And it was terrible. I got very discouraged. And since then, I went on to go to school at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I was there from 2013 to 2015. I studied information science technology. So it's not computer science, but it is a hybrid between the two majors, computer science and business. Honestly, a lot was, I'd say, more business, and then there was still computer science in there. Oh, and a lot of databases. And then 2015, I graduated, went on to start at Kohl's Corporation as a software engineer, and been at a corporate, and then I've been at a startup, consultancy. So I've been in many different roles.
Mm-hmm.
Is that Kohl's like the department store Kohl's?
Yeah. Yep.
Nice.
So you can tell
Discounts.
a lot about our. So you can tell a lot about our interview process. The fact that I actually didn't know that Jon Major had a CS degree, or CS-like degree until now. I don't know. It's just not something that we really think about because I guess of the three owners, only one of us has a CS degree or a degree at all, to be honest. And I'm not one of them. So I don't really think of it in terms of, being a requirement for working at Infinite Red. So congrats on your degree, Jon Major.
Thanks.
I would just like to point out that it took Jamon 4 years to convince me to do anything remotely scary like being on a podcast. And Jon Major's been here for 2 months? And you're already the editor-in-chief of the newsletter and are on the podcast. So kudos.
It's amazing what you can get people to do when you make it a condition of their employment. I'm just joking.
But not really.
I did not do that. No, Jon Major's been doing a lot of cool stuff around here, and hopefully we'll have you on the podcast more regularly. I'd love to have some more help like that. So very cool. I should mention that this episode is sponsored by Infinite Red. A big surprise. We are a premier React Native design and development agency located fully remotely in the USA and a little bit in Canada, and also Wisconsin, which is kind of its own little thing, right? With years of React Native experience, deep roots in the React Native community, we're the hosts of Chain React, and we publish the React Native newsletter, as already mentioned, to over, how many subscribers do we have now, Jon Major? It's over 12,000, right?
Yes. It's over 12,000 and then just under active, I guess, readers.
Like, honestly, we get an incredible amount of active readers on that newsletter. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But Infinite Red is the best choice for your next React Native app. Hit us up, hello@infinite.red. Email me directly, jamin@infinite.red. Do not email Robin. She will ignore your email.
I'll just forward it to Jamon. That's really just what happened.
It's true, actually. I don't think that's actually ever happened, but it will, I'm sure, at some point. You can learn more on our website, infinite.red. Don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio podcast. It's very important to say that. And also, we are hiring React Native engineers. If you are a senior level React Native engineer located in the US or Canada, go to careers.infinite.red and fill out the form. Jon Major did that earlier this year, and now he's on the podcast. So
it works.
Could be you.
That could be you.
All right, let's get into our topic for today. Our topic is moving from React.js to React Native. And what's kind of interesting about this topic, and I'm glad Jon Major's here because Robin, you didn't actually do React.js before you came to Infinite Red and started doing React Native, right?
I did not. I was doing backend Rails and then immediately learned React Native from there. So I had no React.js experience at all.
And I had a bunch of web experience. I did, a lot of different technologies over the years. And I had done things like Ember, but we were actually doing Ember when we decided to move to React Native, which is kind of a weird transition. And so for both Robin and myself, we sort of backed into React.js. It was kind of like we did React Native and then we're like, well, I suppose we should learn React.js too, because that's sort of the underlying thing. Jon Major, you went the other direction though, right?
Yes, correct.
So you were doing React.js before, you had experience working with it. And then when you came to Infinite Red, now you're in the process of really kind of moving into React Native and working on that. You're already on a project, you're already contributing. So we're going to be talking to you over the course of this and asking questions. But I can also... So you recently started on a React Native project this year when we hired you a few months ago. And so you're going to have a different perspective because you did go from React.js to React Native. We went sort of the other direction. I still think there's probably some things we can bring to the table for this discussion. So we'll be hitting on some of that. One of the cool things about React is that React Native sort of it's almost like a byproduct of making UI a function of state, as people like to say. There's a great article, I'll link to it in the show notes, where the author describes the idea of React using jQuery. You know, we were doing a lot of jQuery back in the day, and that was, extremely popular. But he kind of like remade React using jQuery, like a few lines of jQuery. And it was super, that was like when it clicked for me. Like, oh, this totally makes sense now. Like, I totally get it. And really what it does, it takes this sort of like spaghetti of events and effects and things like that, and makes them all focus in on one central point, which is state. It's like, okay, any event is going to update the state and goes to the UI from there. So the UI just sort of like it's a byproduct of state. That when you change state, then the UI changes. When you change anything in state, and it could change any part of the UI. It's really, really cool. But that wasn't the only thing. It also allowed you to then have a really easy translation layer between the state and the UI. So for React Web, that's React DOM. React DOM takes the state and says, now I'm going to update the DOM, which is, of course, the web version of the UI. And so once you have React DOM, now you can do something different. And so the brilliant folks at Facebook that came up with React Native were like, well, let's just build a new React DOM, but for Android and for iOS. And that's what they did to build that. That's a great idea in theory, but React.js itself is still coupled to web a bit because you still have divs, you still have spans, you're still using anchor tags for links. Mm-hmm. I think there was like a period of time where it was like, it's sort of going as far that way as it can, but it still wanted to retain a lot of the familiar things that HTML web developers were used to.
So from my perspective, going from React.js to React Native, I found that the spans, the A tags, the divs, just about every single tag that you can mention, every single tag that you can mention in HTML is gone. And so now there's just React Native components that are there for you. And so that was a little bit trippy to start, being someone who, wants to throw a div around, items to, say, flex it or display it in some different way.
Now you just do a view.
Yeah. So now you just do a view. But what I found is the views also have its limitations too. So if you're doing a view and if you're styling that view, you don't have that luxury of cascading, say, CSS color property down to a text element versus in HTML. If you wanted to style like a span within a div, you could hypothetically on the div just say color is green, and then that span should inherit that color. But that doesn't exist in React Native. So I find like you have to do a lot more styling in different spots to achieve what you want.
It's very explicit styling.
Yes.
Like declarative, which some people have actually said is easier. Like I'm working with a developer on a client project right now who just started doing React Native, coming from a web background, and he's like, I love these React Native styles because it's a lot easier to keep track of what's styled with what properties, because it's just like you have to give it directly to the element, tell it exactly what its style is going to be, and there's not any sort of inherited from somewhere magical.
Yeah, I feel like web developers who kind of came in as web developers sort of look at CSS as the way to style anything. but it's really kind of just a take. It's a particular opinionated way to do it. There are definitely other ways to style, the colored boxes that we put on screens.
Which is really what it comes down to.
That's pretty much what
we're making colored boxes on the screen.
That's
exactly.
What matters.
we try to make it sound more dramatic, but that's honestly it.
But yeah, it's really interesting seeing people come from CSS, which is the way to style the web and has been for ever, and learning how to style in React Native versus someone like me who I didn't do any front end web at all. I was all back end web, and so I had really never worked with CSS. And then I learned React Native styles, and I was like, yeah, this makes sense. And I still don't know CSS because React Native is all I've ever known.
Yeah, I feel like for someone who comes from React.js to React Native, one may think that person should be okay with the CSS and JS, which I am, but part of me still is just like, yeah, I really do like, CSS or Sass. But still, even with like just the CSS and JS that React Native provides, I do think you're right, Robin, is like it's super explicit. You can find where the styles exist because that style tag is more than likely going to exist on the component that it reflects. So totally.
I think it bothers people who like the efficiency of CSS. Like people who are really good at CSS and can use just like a couple of lines of CSS code and like style like a whole bunch of different parts of their app really love that efficiency. And then there's people like me who like just get lost and like, where is the style coming from? I don't know. And like really love the sort of explicitness of React Native styles.
Talked about this in our styling episode a little bit, and I feel like, yeah, the explicitness, it almost reminds me a lot of sort of the argument between inheritance and composition, because you can certainly spread your styles around just by composing them. You can be like, hey, I have this style, I'm going to export it as a const, and then I'm just going to spread it, my style into any elements that need that. And then it explicitly says this style is coming from over here. And that's one of the problems I have with CSS that I've always had with CSS is like, how do I know where the style came from? Now, I will say modern browsers and specifically like the inspectors are incredible about tracking down where does this style come from. So you have tools, and a web developer listening to this and be like,
the tools.
Well, yeah, I always know how to, but you do need the tools.
The code doesn't do a good job of explaining itself.
Yeah, not at all. And like someone like myself who lives in like browser dev tools for like anything like CSS styling, it's so helpful to do all your CSS styling there and then just copy paste into your CSS. Unfortunately, it's not going to translate exactly the same because it's going to need to be camel case in JavaScript. But even at that, it does help a lot. And I find that as a limitation in React Native that I didn't even think to myself would be a problem. Because there is no like real dev tools that you can actually change like the CSS and do all those things right there and get immediate feedback to then take and run with it. You just have to, do it in the code, save it, and
hot reload.
Yep, hot reload, and then get right back to it. Rinse and repeat.
Yep.
Yeah, that's definitely a big difference between React.js. I mean, that a React.js developer coming into React Native is going to notice that the tooling is different at best and worse, more likely
worse.
There are some cool things like Reactatron is fantastic, but Reactatron's also available on the web. It works on the web. So there's a lot of we're in a little bit of a niche here. And because of that, we're going to be a little underserved with the tooling that is available.
Yeah.
And, we work around that and we deal with that, but it certainly has been, I'm sure there's tooling on the way. It's, React Native is getting more and more popular every single year. And I'm sure that as Microsoft invests so much and Facebook invests so much, that the tooling will get better. And we've seen that with like Flipper, for example, Flipper getting better, and Reactatron now works with Flipper. I think that it will continue to get better, but it will always lag behind web because web is just the gigantic, massive, the biggest pool of developers out there.
Definitely. I think after a certain amount of time, like I've developed sort of instincts about the React Native styles. And like I can style a few components before I even like reload the app, and they pretty much do what I kind of expect, but it took a long time to get there. But hot reload is really key for those like try it and see what happens kind of moments.
Yeah, we had that in the previous native coding system that we used, and we had developed that. Actually, Todd Worth and I, Todd, the editor of this podcast and my business partner, he and I came up with a live reload system that worked pretty similarly to what you use in React Native, and it was pretty awesome. But with native code, the biggest problem with it that we were still trying to work on when we ended up, kind of ditching that and moving toward React Native was if you made a syntax error, it would crash your app like right in the middle of it. Just boom. I guess that kind of still happens. Like if you make a syntax error, you're going to get a red screen,
and then you have to reload.
So I guess they haven't solved that either. That was definitely a thing that we were kind of working through. But it was I remember the cycle with native code was like you had to rebuild and then navigate back to where you were. It was so slow, so annoying. And this was like, you save and it changes. You save and it changes. And it like blew everybody away at that time. Now everybody kind of expects it because it's been around for a while. But at that time, back in, I think it was 2014 or 15, it was a big deal.
Back in 2013, I started as I think you would call it maybe an intern or a student developer. I think I would say student developer. So I started as a student developer at a company at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where we were doing mobile application development. And I was there for a couple of years. But when I first started, mind you, I had basically no knowledge of software development at all, because this is 2013 when I first started college. But when I started there, we were using Titanium Appcelerator. I'm not too sure if... Okay, so you've heard of it.
I've heard of it.
Okay, cool. So we used that, and it was... we tried Ionic in that time too, but Titanium Appcelerator was very slow, and there was no hot reloading. It was just jQuery, HTML, and CSS, but it was more comfortable in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and on the web, I think people are kind of... They expect, these tools. They expect hot reloading. They expect all of these things because there are such amazing systems out there now for web. So there's a lot of changes. Now you can use a lot of the same things. You can use Redux. You can use, of course, Mobx State Tree. You can use Lodash. You can use Ramda. You can use a lot of the same tools that you would use on web. And so I'm sure a lot of that stuff is familiar for people who are coming from React.js to React Native. And I think what we found with our new developers coming on as we hire is that they can be productive. If they know React.js, they can be productive in about a week. I mean, not very much time. It's just learning like, okay, you're going to do views. You're not going to do divs and spans. You're going to do views. You're going to, these are the ways that we kind of, you have screens and, not pages. You don't have URLs.
Navigation is a huge difference.
It's quite a bit different. Yeah. Because instead of having a routing library, you have a navigation library, and you're moving from screen to screen. There really isn't a concept of URLs in React Native. I guess React Navigation sort of brings that back a little bit, but
yeah, because there's params. So that was similar to my experience doing React.js. I didn't really feel React Navigation was difficult. My thing was learning a new state management library, which was Mobx.
Yeah. Which if you had already known that, it wouldn't have been a big transition, but obviously changing from the web paradigm to native and also learning that was a challenge. One big thing also is the native side, because it's React Native and we have native code. And so in React Native, you have the ability or sometimes the necessity to drop into native code, Objective-C, Swift, Kotlin, Java. I'm sure that Java course that you took, Jon Major, will come in extremely handy.
Actually, it was C#.
Was it C#? Okay,
C#.
I mean, it is what it is. But what's sort of the equivalent in web? Like, what would be the equivalent of dropping into native if you were on a web context using React, JS?
Is there?
Yeah. I don't think
is there.
So it's a leading question because I do have an answer for that. I look at it as sort of like when you just start writing JavaScript. Maybe you're using jQuery or something else to just mess with the DOM. change things. You're just writing something that is, like the native side of a browser. Maybe you're accessing browser DOM or browser. Maybe you're accessing browser APIs that are browser specific.
Just turns out that the native side of React.js is still JavaScript.
That's right. Yeah, it's still JavaScript.
It's
exactly.
the same language, but there is a native equivalent, which is
so it's harder to tell
pure,
when you're
pure
doing
JavaScript.
That. Where when you drop from JavaScript into Objective-C, you kind of know.
Yeah, it's a much bigger difference.
I'd say building Chrome plugins would be like as native as I have gotten, but yeah, I mean, at that point, it still is JavaScript, as we said. But yes, they only work in Chrome, as far as I know. Yeah,
and so like you do have to, and obviously, I would say, like Robin, you haven't dropped into native all that often in the 5 years that you've been doing React Native, right?
I've done five or six client apps, and it's still really rare, if ever, because the ecosystem of third-party libraries is so robust at this point that pretty much anything you need to do in the native layer, someone has already written a package for that.
And you just have to link it, which has been a problem.
Linking, auto-linking was a really welcome.
What do you mean? You just write an anchor and you point it to with an href, right? Like that's
what you mean by linking, right?
With the bang, and it just navigates nowhere. Just errors. No, I've found setting up like the linking stuff for React Native with the native dependency to be a lot of work. In some cases, I just was linking a package called background geolocation from TransistorSoft, not sponsored. But I was linking that package, and it was just so many intrinsic details about, what you have to do in iOS, then what you have to do in Android, and then, cross your fingers that it works in both spots. And you don't want to get too far ahead in like one or the other, playing around with it, because then you'll forget that you have to go back to fixing like the linking issues so you can test on that other device. So that's another big thing is now you have two devices usually that you're testing on, and not just, I'll be honest, I'm not the only one here. I would hope you just opened up Chrome and you test only in Chrome.
Works.
Cross your fingers. It works. Yep, exactly. Ship it. Unless if someone says, hey, Firefox or Internet Explorer doesn't work.
Yeah, and not only do you have two devices you're sending it to, but you also have 3 package managers. You have your package.json with Yarn or NPM. You also have CocoaPods on the iOS side, and you have Gradle on the Android side. And those all have their own idiosyncrasies. They have their different languages. I think, of course, package.json is written in JSON, which is a JavaScript subset. And you have Ruby on CocoaPods.
I always found that super random.
Isn't that random?
Super random.
Ruby but like macOS came with Ruby built in. So that kind of makes sense. I don't know if it still does.
It still does. I do not recommend using System Ruby, though.
Right.
Get yourself a Ruby version manager.
A real Ruby. And then on the Gradle side, it's written in Groovy.
Yes.
Like not even in Java, not even in Kotlin, but in Groovy of all things. Yeah. And so you're having several more languages to learn, more kind of runtimes that you're dealing with. And so, that's another fun part of this. Linking can be, now, it's been getting better. When we started with React Native, we had to manually link everything. Now there's a lot of auto linking happening, which is really, really nice.
I was just looking at that package that you mentioned, Jon Major, and it does support auto linking, but then there's a bunch of stuff you have to do beyond the auto linking, because location is so permissions intensive because of Apple's privacy rules, which is fair.
And you have to deal with Xcode and Android Studio too. So, that in and of itself brings a whole nother dimension.
Yeah, I would say going from React Native and learning React.js had a huge advantage, because all of the quote unquote like hard stuff about the native environment, like you said, Android Studio and Xcode and native modules and linking and Not to mention like certificates and code signing and app store releases and all that. We already knew all of that. And React.js, going to React.js, there's fewer differences to learn, I think.
You're like, is this all? I must be missing something. Is this all there is? Now, I would say mixing native developers with web developers has led to a lot of interesting collisions. I would say mostly positive collisions. There's been some, kind of culture clash kind of things that happen, but it's really interesting. There's this kind of huge influx of web developers into the native world, and they bring certain assumptions like, why can't we have this? Why don't we have this? Why don't we have this? And the native side, they bring their own kind of take on things. And I think they're very critical to this
like,
as
hey,
well.
Get out of our playground. Like, what?
There is some of that.
It's my sand.
This is my sandbox.
You see some of that. But I know some people that did native development for many years and knew Xcode inside and out that switched over to, in fact, actually we had Orta on React Native Radio several episodes ago. And he told me that they decided to use React Native even when they were only using it for iOS. And this is like a company Artsy, that just was absolute, geniuses at iOS development. And yet they still decided to use React Native because it was a better developer experience. So they brought a lot to the table, Artsy did. And I think that other native developers as well. These collisions have led to better tooling, better software, better techniques.
Coinbase is also another example of focusing on one platform, at least initially. So they focused on Android initially, getting the development all done with React Native and then transitioning to the iOS side later. They also just recently did this. And the cool thing about this is they tried to do it as a brownfield project, and then they realized that it wasn't the best way of doing it. And so they went greenfield. And so the problem that they ran into, like doing brownfield, which is basically taking something that exists today and then trying to take a different technology and shove it into the current platform that's there, they realized that the React Native developers and then the React.js developers were basically butting heads because there was the issue with React Native code being there that the React.js developers could handle. And then there was the native code there that only the native developers could handle. And so it just caused a lot of problems between the two different types of developers, which made more sense to go greenfield, which is actually one of the posts that I published in the React Native newsletter this time around. So
that's a great lead into our next section. So we are going to kind of wrap up our main topic there. And by the way, I am working on a little sneak peek. I am working on getting some of the Coinbase developers on the program. So when we get a chance to do that, hopefully we'll be able to release that episode in the next few months. But good lead into the next section, news from the newsletter. That's a working title. I don't have a great title for this yet, but news from the newsletter. Well, we have the editor-in-chief of the React Native newsletter here, Jon Major. Mm-hmm. Let's do that new section. And what has caught your eye lately? I guess you already led into it, the Coinbase.
Yeah, the Coinbase successfully transitioning to React Native was definitely one of them. And then Stripe had officially released a public beta to their Stripe native library.
Oh, that's very cool. I did see that, and that's going to be. We could have used that actually last year. There was a big project we did where we could have used the features of the Stripe Connect. So very cool. If you want to check that out, go to reactnativenewsletter.com. Subscribe to that. You're going to be seeing some great articles come through. Jon Major does a good job of summarizing them in the little sections, and it's a fantastic way to stay up to date about React Native. Very cool. So that's a new section that when Jon Major's on, we're going to have him talk about something cool that he has caught his eye in the React Native newsletter. We also have another section that we do sometimes when we have time, weird bugs. Robin, do you have a weird bug today?
I do. I have a really fun bug that we encountered the other day. Well, fun. I don't know if fun is the right word. But it's one of those things that just reminds me how huge the React Native API is and how there's still lots of stuff I don't know about it. But our lovely QA team informed me that we we had this complex screen that has a scroll view and then a bunch of smaller scroll views within it. And it looks beautiful on iOS. But he realized that the inner scroll views, the smaller ones, were not scrolling on Android. And I was like, oh no. I love those Android-only bugs that usually take me days to figure out. But I did some Googling, and apparently there's a prop for that. Who knew?
There's a prop for that.
There's a prop for that. Nested scroll enabled is a property on React Native Scroll View that lets you do nested scroll views, and it's only on Android. And it defaults to false.
Why?
For whatever reason. A React Native core team, tell me on Twitter, why is this defaulting to false? Is there maybe there's a performance implication for it? I'm not sure.
Probably because they didn't want to break existing behavior.
Could be.
Even though it was already broken.
So if you need to nest scroll views within each other on Android, make sure you've set nested scroll enabled to true, at least on the child scroll view. I did it on both for good measure. But
Okay, so it worked when you did it on both. Yeah. Speaking of, there's a prop for that. I'm one of the maintainers of React Native WebView, and I'm pretty sure there's a prop for that for just about anything. That is a huge API, and I'm sorry.
And it's changing all the time because it changes along with the native API. So this is something that was added in Android API 21. So your app does have to have a minimum SDK version of 21. But so every time the sort of native APIs change, there'll be props added to React Native eventually. So it's always changing. I recommend maybe check the docs out if you haven't looked at them in a while. There may be something that surprises you.
Robin added that to our new internal wiki. She's been kind of leading the team, putting together an engineering wiki for us, and she added it as a TIL.
Love me a good wiki.
Absolutely. Very cool. Well, thanks so much to both of you. Where can people find you? Jon Major, where are you at on Twitter?
Jon Major C. I'm Jon Major C everywhere.
Okay.
It's so satisfying when you can get an internet handle that you have it like everywhere.
But don't get any ideas, people. That's mine.
My problem is I got married in the middle of my internet life, and
some stuff is still
is still my old name.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, well, I'm, as far as I know, the only Jamon Holmgren in the world.
I have never met another Jamon, let alone another Holmgren. So
I've met other Jamons. There's other Jamons for sure. But yeah, I mean, it's a rare name combination there. Robin, you are at Robin_Heinz with an E at the end, and I am at Jamon Holmgren, of course. React Native Radio is React Native RDIO. We dropped the A at the end for characters reasons. So yes, thanks again to our guest host, Jon Major, for joining us today. As always, thanks to our producer and editor, Todd Worth, our transcript and release coordinator, Jed Bartowski, and our social media coordinator, Missy Warren. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out, infinite.red/React Native. Special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe. Send this to someone who may be thinking about going from React.js to React Native. Might give them a little bit of an insight into what that takes. Reminder, Infinite Red is hiring React Native engineers. If you're a senior level React Native engineer located in the US or Canada, I think in Canada they have to say developer, right?
Yeah,
they can't say engineer
because
you
need a certification for that.
If you're a React Native developer, did that work? That didn't work. I tried to do the Canadian thing.
Don't worry, I can't do it either.
I'm just a hoser. I don't know. This is bad. Okay, I'm just going to move on. If you're a senior level React Native developer located in the US or Canada, go to careers.infinite.red and hit us up. We'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.